Welcome back to the podcast, Mallory. Today, we're talking about something that affects almost everyone at some point, and that's Uber and Lyft accidents in Washington.
Yes, and specifically, the thing that most people don't realize, which is if you are in the right phase of a rideshare trip, there may be a $1 million insurance coverage available.
Yeah, and this is the important part. It depends entirely on what the driver was doing at the exact moment of the crash.
Yeah, so let's talk about why rideshare cases are different from a typical car crash, right? So, rideshare cases, there isn't just one insurance policy. There are multiple layers that turn on and off depending on the status of the app, the rideshare app.
Yeah, and that part's actually written into the Washington law under RCW 48.177. Rideshare companies called commercial transportation services providers, they must carry different insurance depending on whether the driver is actually logged in to the app or just waiting or actively on a ride.
Yeah, so the first question in any Uber or Lyft or rideshare crash is, was the app on, was it off, or was there an active ride happening?
Yeah, and this is important because in the different phases, it will affect the type of coverage that you may or may not have. And phase one, this is the easiest of the phases. If the app is actually off, then it's pretty simple. The driver's treated like any other driver on the road. Their own personal insurance policy applies.
Yeah, so even if you're an Uber or Lyft driver, if you're not using the app, even if you're using the card that you usually use for that, if you're not using the app actively at the time, if it's off completely, no coverage. Phase two is the app is on, but no ride has been accepted yet, right? So the app is on, but they haven't actually started using it. They've logged in, but they haven't accepted a ride yet. So in this case, Washington law actually requires that code that you mentioned requires a minimum coverage of $50,000 per person, $100,000 per accident, and $30,000 in property damage. So that's required for the rideshare Uber or Lyft to provide in that situation.
Yeah, and so the distinction is that if you're just a normal driver on the road, the minimum policy is $25.50, and in this case, the statute actually requires $5,100, so a little bit of higher coverage. And where this would apply is like, let's say you're actually looking for a ride, but you don't have one right now, and so you're deciding, well, maybe I'll go to Safeway and pick up a drink or whatever. So in that situation, your personal cover, like if you caused an accident, the Uber driver would only have coverage of 50,000, 100 on the minimum end.
Right. And this is really important because this is where a lot of crashes happen. As you can imagine, a good portion of a rideshare driver's time is spent looking for rides and when they're not actively accepting one. So this is when a lot of accidents, a huge percentage of accidents happen in this phase two.
Yeah. And then phase three, this is the big one because you're an Uber driver or a Lyft driver, you have your app on, and then all of a sudden somebody has accepted a ride. And at that point, you have your coverage jumps to $1 million in liability and $1 million in uninsured or underinsured motorist coverage.
And this is specifically required under Washington law. The law that we were talking about requires this jump in coverage during this pre-arranged ride, which, as you said, begins when the driver accepts the ride. So even before the passengers entered the car, once the driver accepts the ride, that's when the ride begins, and it ends when the passenger exits the car.
And that's where the $1 million policy comes into play. And like an example of that would be, let's say that they're picking up somebody in, I don't know, Yakima. The whole ride from, Federal Way or from Tacoma all the way over to Yakima, even though they don't even have the passenger in their car, would be covered for the $1 million policy because they have the app on and they've accepted a ride. So it doesn't matter that the passenger is not in there yet.
Yeah, which is important to know if you're in an accident with an Uber driver, which we'll talk about a little bit more later, sort of the practical application of this. But it's important to know because even if they don't have a passenger, you might still be eligible to have some compensation from that $1 million policy if you're injured in an accident with the driver. So, going into that a little bit, let's break down sort of the difference between what happens when you're a driver versus a passenger, when you're driving the rideshare or in the rideshare versus when you're hit by someone in a rideshare. So let's break this down because this can get confusing.
Like a really simple rule is if you're actually a passenger in a Uber or a Lyft or in some sort of rideshare, you're going to get the best coverage. You're going to get the $1 million coverage.
Yeah, absolutely, which makes sense, right? You're always going to be in phase 3 if you're a passenger, the Uber driver's car. If you're a passenger in a car that's hit by the driver, you're not in the rideshare, that's different, right? But if you're in the rideshare, actively on a ride, you are eligible for that $1 million policy. And also, if someone else is at fault and hits the Uber, right, then you're eligible for that UIM coverage, uninsured motorist coverage, in case the other driver that was at fault doesn't have coverage. You have some coverage through the rideshare.
Yeah. And if you are just driving along and an Uber driver who has a passenger in their vehicle hits you, then you're also entitled to $1 million coverage.
Yeah, if a passenger is involved, that $1 million coverage comes into play.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that situation where you're another driver and you're hit by an Uber, but they don't have a passenger in the car. That's where we get into the whether it's phase 1 or phase 2 matters, right? Whether they were using their car with the app open and logged in versus not using it at all, right?
Yeah. And, the easy mistake that you might make is if you see the Uber driver doesn't have a passenger and he hits you and it's a pretty bad accident, you might think, oh, well, he wasn't working at the time, so maybe I'm not entitled to $1 million coverage. But that's not true. What you need to figure out is if he's already accepted a ride and he had his app on. That's the real legal piece you need to figure out.
Exactly. And we can figure that out later, but knowing that when the accident happens, especially if you're really badly injured, it's really important to figure that out as soon as possible. So if you can somehow ask some questions, if the police are involved, make sure they know. If you're aware that this is an Uber driver, make sure they know that's an important piece of information that you need, because if you're injured and you need a lot of treatment, you're going to want that $1 million policy, right?
Yeah.
If it's
So
available.
the question that always needs to be answered if you're ever involved in a rideshare accident is what phase was the driver in? And that's the
Right.
first question that needs to be answered.
Yeah. And then there's another scenario that we haven't talked about, which is what if you're the rideshare driver, right? A lot of people do this. And what if someone hits you while you're driving using your app? So if you're the rideshare driver, any one of these could apply, right? So whether your app is on, logged in, and whether you've accepted a ride is really important. And it's important to know if you have accepted a ride, like you said, if you're in Tacoma, but you've accepted a ride in Yakima and you get hit and it's someone else's fault, that UIM coverage, your rideshare service covers you.
Yeah. And that's important because a lot of times people don't have insurance or they have a small policy, especially in Washington. 25 is the minimum. So if they have a $25,000 policy, I mean, sometimes emergency room visit is 10,000. You get any type of imaging and pretty much your $25,000 has been fully used by that point. So having UIM coverage or coverage as a rideshare driver is very important.
Absolutely. And like you said, the minimum coverages are less than the minimum required for rideshare drivers. So you can imagine, I mean, the rideshare drivers, they're driving a lot more than the average person. So they're more likely, just statistically, to get into an accident. So be aware of the protections that the law gives you as a rideshare driver if you are hit.
Yeah. And if you don't know, just call a lawyer up. Somebody who does these type of cases, and they'll be able to tell you.
Yeah, for sure. And so, Rick, can you talk a little bit about the legal side of ride shares? So the way that insurance works is a little bit interesting for these situations because Uber and Lyft tried to avoid actual liability in these situations, right? Can you talk about that?
Yeah, I mean, they want to say that the drivers are independent contractors. They want to distance themselves from what the drivers do. They want to say, well, they're not actually our employees. We just handle an app and we just match two people together. That's all we do. But, of course, they make a lot of money doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you're working on these cases, they might not actually accept liability, but because Washington has these laws about coverages, you can still have access to that coverage if you're involved in an accident like this.
And that's why, we had a statute that was implemented that said that it's a commercial type vehicle. Well, it's commercial transportation. So we're going to make you have coverage of a minimum of $1 million.
Right. As a protection. Yeah.
Yeah.
So some practical takeaways, what you need to remember as someone who's either a rideshare driver or someone who uses these services or anyone who's on the road while these drivers are out and about. There are 3 phases of coverage. That $1 million policy is available only in phase 3 when there is an active ride, which doesn't necessarily mean there's a passenger, right? Coverage depends entirely on whether that ride was accepted or the passenger was in the car.
Yeah. And that's a great way to look at it. Give us a call if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thanks, Rick.